We're going live in three, two, one. All right, well, welcome everybody to Virtual Friday's Dire Literary Series. My guest tonight is the featured Jonathon Escoffrey. And Jonathon is, the wonderful thing about bios and whatnot I do every week is we do I don't even have to do his bio because all I have to do is go through it. His bio reads all about his awards. So Jonathon is a young writer. He's in California now. He won the 2020 Plimpton Prize for fiction, the ASME National Magazine Award for fiction, the National Endowment for the Arts for prose and literature. He has been mentioned Literary Death Match in Boston. He has been a notable story in the Best American Short Stories series, and he is in the Best magazine article, I believe, articles series. But that's enough out of me. I am happy to turn it over to Jonathon.
Thank you very much for that intro. um, I am going to be reading tonight for just the opening of a story that's actually the opening of a linked story collection in progress that I'm working on, hopefully at the kind of tail end of the project. And so I don't think it needs much setting up, but it's the kind of story in a way that sets up the rest of the book in terms of who these characters are and who this family is that I'm interested in exploring a little bit. So I'm just going to read the first few pages or so. And I'm reading from a story called In Flux. The story was featured in the magazine Passages North a few years ago. So since I'm just reading from the beginning, if anybody does take interest and want to see how the story ends, it's still on their website. So you can check it out there. It begins with, "What are you?" hollered from the perimeter of your front yard when you're 9, younger probably. You'll be asked again throughout junior high and high school, then out in the world, in strip clubs, in food courts, over the phone and at your various menial jobs. The askers are expectant. They demand immediate gratification. The question lifts you slightly off your pre-adolescent toes, tilting you, not just because you don't understand it, but because even if you did understand this question, you wouldn't yet have an answer. Perhaps it starts with, "What language is your mother speaking?" This might be the genesis, not because it comes first, but because at least on this occasion, you have some context for the question when it arrives. It intends to separate you from the norm. You immediately resent this question. "Why does your mother talk so funny?" your neighbor insists. Your mother calls to you from the front porch, has called from this perch overlooking the sloping yard time and again since you were allowed to join the neighborhood kids in play. Always, the signals that playtime is over. Only now, shame has latched itself to the ritual. Perhaps you'd hoped no one would ever notice. Perhaps you'd never noticed it yourself. Perhaps you ask in shallow protest, "What do you mean, what language?" Maybe you only think it. Ultimately, you mutter, "English, she's speaking English," before going inside, head tucked in embarrassment. In this moment, for the first time, you are ashamed of your mother, and you are ashamed of yourself for not further defending her. More so than to be cowardly and disloyal, though, it's shameful to be foreign. If you've learned anything during your short residence on Earth, you've learned this. It's America, and it's the 80s, and at school, in class, you pledge to one and one flag only, the Stars and Stripes. Greatest country on earth is the morning anthem. It's the lesson plan, a mantra drilled into you day in, day out. A fact as inarguable as 2 plus 2 equaling 4. And what you start to hear as you repeat this to yourself is the implication that all other nations, though other nations are seldom mentioned in school at all, are inferior. You believe this. It's an easy lesson to internalize, except that your brother Delano, your parents, nearly all your living relatives are Jamaican. When a cousin you've never met moves from Kingston to Miami to your Cutler Ridge neighborhood, winding up in your 3rd grade class, refusing to pledge allegiance to your flag, you know to distance yourself from her. You say a quiet thanks that your last names are different. If you'd had any context for the question of what you are when it first came, you might have answered American. You were born in the US and you've got the paperwork to prove it. You feel pride in this fact, this inalienable status. You belt Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA on the 4th of July, and even more emphatically, after visiting your parents' island nation for 2 weeks in your seventh summer. You disagree with every aspect of the island life, down to the general lack of central air conditioning. You prefer burgers and hot dogs to jerked or curried anything. Back at home, your parents accuse you of speaking and even acting like a real Yankee. You don't like the tone inflecting it into something disgraceful, but if by Yankee they mean American, you embrace it. I speak English, you respond. Your parents' patois, and what many deem an indecipherable accent, still plays as normal, almost unnoticeable against your ears, except that it is increasingly paired with the punitive. For instance, when your mother says, "Una can spill the thing on the table, una can't clean it," and your brother says, "No me, mommy," and you say, "I didn't do it, mom," she'll say, "Then who did? Must be a duppy." The duppy becomes the scapegoat for all of the inexplicable activity that takes place in and outside of your house. The duppy broke your mother's vase, then tried to glue it back together. The duppy hid your brother's report card underneath his mattress. The duppy possessed your father, dragged his body out for drinks after work, and didn't bring him home until morning. A duppy, or ghost, or even a grown man can be difficult to discipline. So you and your brother alone share the punishments. In school, when your world geography project is announced and you're made to choose from a list of countries to present on, you choose Mongolia. It's not till another student chooses Jamaica that you consider the tiny island a worthy option. Part of your project requires preparing a dish native to the country you've chosen. This is fourth grade. Your mothers do the cooking. When they meet each other on presentation day, eyes ring dark from having wrestled with foreign recipes late into the night, they nod imperceptibly, too exhausted for pleasantries. As your classmate begins her presentation on Jamaica, your mother sucks her teeth, a sound akin to industrial strength Velcro ripping apart, drawing glances from several of the other parents. We could have brought in leftovers, she leans in and whispers, "If only you chose home." On career day, your father stands in front of your class and identifies himself as a general contractor. The block letter alphabet strung along the edge of the blackboard arcs over his wavy black hair. Below the arch, he unspools a foot of measuring tape with the tip of his thumb, then releases it, causing the tape to zip back into its case. The sharp whiz emitted by the swift violence of the retracted tape gains your classmates' undivided awe. Your father repeats this action several times before deigning to speak. Your classmates hold their breath in anticipation. As he explains, "When man need them bathroom fix, is me get all the plaster on PVC and ting, and is me make the worker man come nice up the place." A string of snickers breaks out from the classroom's back row. Your teacher shushes the students quiet, but as your father continues his speech, her face crinkles, head bobbling to the beat of his patois. You concentrate on the pink surfacing over her cheeks, the color spectrum helping to determine the magnitude of this disaster. If she remains a light pink, a shallow blush, a rose petal, a ballet slipper, you'll know this is a faint debasement to be forgotten in the weeks ahead. But as her skin brightens, flashing past punch, nearly violet, you recognize this as catastrophic. You question why you didn't insist your mother come in your father's stead. She knows better how to iron out words for American heirs, as she must for work every day. Earlier in the week, you asked her about the details of her secretarial position. From the edge of your bed, your mother explained that she works in the office of a company that ships jet engines internationally. The hem of her nightie shimmied as she skipped across the room to pull down the globe from atop your bookcase. "You see here, and this here?" She kneeled at your bedside, pointing to Germany, then Brazil, then to the chain of Hawaiian islands, singing, "We go all around the world," dancing her slender index and middle fingers across oceans and lush green continents before lifting them to tap your nose. "We," you asked her. "You don't get to go to these places, do you?" Your mother blinked twice, then walked the globe back to its shelf. Someday, she said. Someday, maybe when you're all grown up. She added, better you ask your father to visit school. Him, they'll find exciting. In your fifth grade history section, you learn more about the founding of America. You learn about the subject referred to simply as slavery. It's an abbreviated, watered down lesson, much like its subject heading. It's mostly good people made a big mistake. It's that was a long, long time ago. It's Honest Abe and Harriet Tubman and MLK fixed all that nasty business. It's now we don't see race. An air of shared embarrassment infiltrates the classroom during this lesson. The students agree this was a terrible event. You're mildly aware that some of your classmates are supposed to have descended from the perpetrators of this atrocity and that some descended from the victims. You're not quite aware that many descended from both. Should you feel slighted by this country you love so dearly, once again, you feel yourself tilting into uncertainty. This is not the first time you've heard of the transatlantic slave trade, as your father never misses an opportunity to denigrate your country of birth. In his boisterous version of the lesson, you learn, that's why these Black people act so. Them come out of bondage not 2 seconds ago, and now they must act civilized. Boy, I tell you, white people wicked, you see. At the height of his lecture, he'll add that slavery in Jamaica ended hundreds of years before slavery ended in America, a claim you'll later learn is off by hundreds of years. He has a word, a Jamaican word, for the Blacks of either nation he deems inappropriate, boto. If ever you do something that might cause him shame, he'll say, you can act like real boto sometimes. Your mother says to you and your brother one day, "Una better no bring no nappy-headed girls home." In your mother's defense, or perhaps to further disparage your mother, her list of girls not to bring home will stretch to the point where you'll wonder if she ever wants you to bring home girls. Don't bring home no coolie, she'll start to warn in middle school. Upon seeing your uncut, coffee-colored Panamanian prom date, she'll lock herself in her bedroom. For her, your mother will have no words at all. And after you graduate, she'll say, please, please, just not a white girl. Promise me that. But this is fifth grade still, and you're confused about her first warning. What constitutes nappy hair to your mother? You study her guitar string follicles, then study the cotton candy curls on your head. You wonder about your own hair's nappiness. You wonder who can't bring you home. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. That was awesome. That was an awesome read. And the first questions that I'm getting are very specific to this story and also the form of this story. So Amy mentioned that she really loves that piece and the voice and what it's saying. So did you have to have any negotiation with the family when writing about personal experiences having to do with them?
No, I haven't had those conversations yet. That's a great question, by the way. And I decided at some point that, I don't know, given my relationship with my parents, our relationship with my art, meaning how much they do and don't read me or what interest they have in it, I decided at some point a while ago that I wasn't really going to ask permission. But we've, over the years, and I'm not saying that's the right the right move at all, but over the years we have we've talked it through. We've talked about, you know, what fiction even means, what creative nonfiction is, what's the distinction between both. My Paris Review piece, especially, that's the first one that my parents really wanted to read, and still not even sure if my father has read it, but I know my mother did, and she had a lot of questions about. It was never from a place of judgment or wondering why I would, you know, deign to write such a piece, but it was more like, how do you call this fiction when so much of this is actually following the kind of mapped out trajectory of my family, of us. And we had a really interesting conversation about that in terms of, you know, what actually did happen, what didn't happen. the way I've gone about, a lot of my fiction career, insofar as it's gone at all. And they both support me wholeheartedly. They don't always understand at all, but they've been supportive.
Well, noting that, you had to explain to them the various forms of writing and why it appears in that form. So I can conclude that your parents weren't writers. So where did writing come from for you?
Yeah, they weren't writers, and maybe my mother does write a lot of poetry, and her mother wrote a lot of poetry. My grandmother died at about 104, and she was, reciting poetry that she learned as a girl, up until she died, just super sharp. Um, my mom was on Facebook posting some of her poems just yesterday. So I shouldn't say that they weren't, or none of them were writers, especially my mother's side is kind of the more creative side. My grandmother's brother was actually a really, um, I guess famous is the word I'm thinking of, but within the sculpting realm, like he was honored by the Queen and all of that. And if you go to National Stadium in Jamaica, you'll see his, 20-foot statues surrounding the stadium of famous runners and Bob Marley and all of that. So there's definitely a creative strain on that side of the family. My mother was really great about reading to me from an early age and making sure that I had all the tools I needed to be an early age reader. Don't ask me what age that was, but she gave me the tools anyway. And so I had a lot of books growing up. It just wasn't. And I know it's like, to even say this in a way is like a kind of elitist thing, but now that I've done an MFA and I'm in a PhD, going through my MFA, a lot of the writers, their parents were like English professors, and they were reading Hemingway from 7 years old and that type of thing, or Baldwin or whoever, and that wasn't at all my experience, but they definitely had me reading. I read a lot of like plot heavy YA as a kid, and I no regrets.
So it was noted that this story was written in the second person. Have you ever tried was the story ever written in the first or the third person? And if not, why did you go with the second person in this story in particular?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I started it in second because I had noticed it is the first story I wrote in second person, and I was noticing that a lot of the stories I admired that were written in second person carried the story across years, starting with maybe Laurie Moore's How to Be a Writer, and then a lot of Junot Diaz after that, Janine Capel-Crusette's How to Leave Hialeah. And so, in my first workshops, I was told story should happen within the most contained amount of time as possible. And we're told this in classes for good reason. There's there are a lot of reasons to consider that, but I wanted to think about. There's a story that follows this in my book, and that's the Paris Review one that talks about immigration. So the story actually takes place like preceding this story that I just read from. And so I'm really interested in these stories that cover like what's the effect of something, of a kind of narrow lens on something like identity, something like race, something like immigration, but carried out over a span of years. Because I just don't, I'm sure that there are writers who will say, well, this is the pivotal moment that kind of distills that experience. But maybe I'm just not that writer, and I really wanted to explore what the compounding effect of having an experience over years and years and years and what that would be. And that's what this story is. This story goes from the part I read up until the narrator is about to come home from college.
All right, if someone noticed that you altered the story since they have read it, do you do this often? Is that a correct statement, or?
Yeah, that will be a correct, that's a correct statement. Yeah, it's a combination of getting the story ready for going out to publishers to try to sell it. So I'm working with an agent. So she comes back with edits, regardless of. Um, I mentioned before that this is a linked story collection, and so there are ways in which a story has to stand alone when it goes to the magazine, and then there's a way in which the stories need to make sure that they speak to each other when they're together in the book form, so that the editor who's considering buying it sees how it all fits. And it's very closely linked, like it's almost novelesque, but sometimes you just read a sentence over and over, and uh, well, sometimes you read it over and over, you think it's great, you think it's perfect, and then years later you come back to a thing and it's like, oh, like obviously I should have cleaned it up and made it leaner and get rid of the dead weight. Yeah, that's
I know MFA programs and PhD programs, they really encourage, in fact, they really push intentional or unintentional themes. Now, is that something that you picked up in your studies? You said your stories are linked. Is that something that you did, you worked through with your education, or is that something that you had decided to do on your own?
I would say that I was trying to me, what MFA programs do is that the workshops are really set up for critiquing stories and not novels. Um, Really good novelists who teach. Like I went to Breadloaf and was in a Matt Johnson workshop, and he, more than anyone that I've experienced, is someone who can read 15 pages, the opening 15 pages of your novel, and then go to the board and just map out the entire novel with you to say, okay, what happens next? And okay, this is a beat that we would expect. What happens here? And take you from those first 15 pages all the way to the end. In my experience, most teachers, they can't do that. And I think that speaks to a lot of us aren't really, depending on where you go to school, you may not be taught to teach. You may be a very successful writer, but there's just very few, I would say, like standardized methods. Other than there are great craft books that we can all learn from, but I find that especially, usually, I don't know that Matt Johnson ever did this or has any interest in this, but someone like Charles Baxter, he was at my MFA, someone who has written a craft book or two, tends to be like really great at teaching craft. And that's not to say craft is everything, but so when it comes to content, I never had anyone tell me like lean into a particular kind of content or lean into ultimately having a linked story collection. I think because you have to turn in, it's the usual standard is like you turn in 2 stories per semester. I think I did turn in what I thought was going to be a novel excerpt, but that can be, other than the advice to just keep going, that can be a little bit just not helpful, because sometimes you've thought things through and sometimes you haven't, and the advice can kind of be all over the place. And so, yeah, I think it just, the educational model really lent itself to stories.
So what, in terms of, we'll talk from your experience. I don't want you to make a broad statement, but what is the most used advice you hear about creative writing that you personally don't agree with, or think that it's not as weighted as it, or it's weighted too much?
That's a good question. I'm sure whatever I respond, I'll think of something better after this interview. But I mean, like the show don't tell thing, I think can be harmful to people who are working in traditions that aren't necessarily, the American readership hasn't necessarily been exposed to a certain tradition. And so there are less quick cues for people to pick up on what you're talking about. So if I'm writing about Jamaican Americans, I just don't think there's been that many books written by Jamaican Americans about being a Jamaican American. that are going to have you, you know, me put you in scene, and you being outside of that culture is necessarily going to know, you know, what the cues are, what the quick cues are, in a way that, you know, if I'm writing about Brooklyn or something like that, and there's just, you know, we all, or Hollywood for that, you know, we've been trained to read through certain lenses, through a New York lens, through a LA centric lens. I say read, I'm including like viewing, but so sometimes I feel I have to tell. So a story like this, I felt like I had to tell. I had to explain like where this character is coming from. That doesn't mean every single story is in my collection is going to work that way. They absolutely don't. But especially trying to get a foundation, and this is not just saying I, as the writer, want readers, like I'm only writing to readers outside of my experience, thus I have to explain. I think when the tradition is so new, not to overstate newness, because obviously I'm not like the first Jamaican writing anything, but or Jamaican American, but sometimes you're explaining to yourself what your experience is. Like, because if you haven't seen it written, then you don't even know. Like, it happened, but it's like, did that happen? How did that happen? You have to explain it to yourself. And so that's in times when I think telling is necessary.
Now, you've moved around a lot. Has that influenced what you write? And if you're in the middle of a collection of stories, has that become jarring to you?
Yeah. So I won't say that I've been jarred by, let's say, wanting to, you know, move from Miami to Minnesota and then suddenly wanted to write about Minnesota, and then to Boston, and then to Western Mass, to LA. Like, I haven't, the content has stayed the same, but I think moving for me takes a big toll. And so it's really not till like the first year passes that I can really figure out like where I'm at. That first year is just trying to, you know, stay afloat, doggy paddle.
Now, someone's looking forward to your collection. Has it been sold by your agent? And if so, when's it coming out?
Has not been sold. We haven't gone out with it yet. We are talking about I'm like knocking on wood and trying to, you know, cross all the fingers, but we're trying to go out with it early next year, like January, February.
All right. I read up on you a little bit, and when you were in high school, you worked your way through. You were a dishwasher. You failed at life insurance. So did I, in fact. I was good at actually packing it in at 2 o'clock after no sales and going to a bar, which is not really good for the job experience. But the one that really caught me was unlicensed physical therapist. Now, how does that mean that you were working as a physical therapist illegally, or you were doing physical therapy not as? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was a job I found on Craigslist, and I think I was trying to. I was working overnights at Home Depot, and I was trying to recommit to uh, education. I'd been going to. I went to college at 18 and was like, "What am I doing here?" And then around 25, started or 24, started taking classes part time. So I knew that was just going to stretch over so many years that if I could try to find a part time gig that I could balance full time school with, then I really needed to hustle and try to make that work. So I found this job. It was this guy who he was a quadriplegic. He had been paralyzed when he was in high school because he was a gymnast who they hadn't. He'd fallen on his neck, but also the school hadn't done like the double layering of the mat, and he just really did not want somebody who had the traditional training, because he'd worked with people. He was by this point mid 30s, and so over 20 years, he decided like what was best for him. He just knew what was best for him essentially, and so he wanted somebody that he could train to do the therapy in the way that he thought was best for him. And so I did that for about a year before he was from Virginia, and I was down in Miami at the time, and he wound up moving back there. But it was a really cool gig, really great guy. Yeah, really interesting job.
It sounds rewarding, and I'm glad that you explained it, because when I think of that, I'm thinking like unlicensed dentist. It sounds really like
No,
kind of
yeah, yeah.
scary.
And I'm from the place which is like every week there's a news story about the unlicensed dentist. I'll have to think about whether I should keep that on my website or not.
Now you've won a lot of awesome awards, and we've had a National Endowment of the Arts, the Plimpton Prize from the Paris Review, Distinguished Story, Best American Short Stories. And which one took you by surprise? They're all great awards, but which one were you thrilled the most to receive?
The Plimpton Prize, I'd say. For just so many reasons, I think. I was submitting to the Paris Review for a really long time, something like 20 years, and it was one of the. I think when you're like a baby writer, and you're just trying to figure things out, you learn about what a literary journal is in the first place, or magazine. It's like, oh wow, like they have these things. I think the Paris Review was one of the first that I ever learned about. I think when I first submitted there, was kind of very naively thinking, oh yeah, first time, obviously they're going to pick this up. It's going to be love at first sight, mutually. And I just kind of followed that a journey for my own journey of submitting to them, learning to be a better writer, learning the mistakes I was making, reading a lot of their interviews. I think when I found out that my story was accepted by them, I immediately thought of that prize, just because, I don't know, it just seemed like the perfect storybook end to that journey. And the NEA is great, but you can kind of continue submitting for that. And the Plimpton Prize is one that, if I understand it correctly anyway, there's a certain point where you're not necessarily eligible for it, I think. Like if you're, because it's for new writers, whatever that means, newer writers, emerging writers. And so if I were 3 books in, let's say, I don't think that's something that I would still be eligible, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Very last question. You said that winning the Plimpton Prize was the perfect storybook ending to your submission process to the Paris Review. What do you think is the perfect storybook ending for Jonathon Escoffrey?
Oh, wow.
You gave me this idea, sorry.
Wow, that's such a big question. I don't know. Really, I mean, just to be able to keep doing this. I was lucky to get into the USC PhD, because it's something that allows me to continue just putting writing first, which I made that decision maybe 10 years ago, which is when I applied for my MFA. Coming from a place like Miami, which is great for so many reasons. It's not, as a city, it's more friendly to the visual arts, to certain genres of music. I felt like it would be very easy to kind of lose focus and lose track of, just because I didn't feel like I had a ton of people who are like, yeah, like we're gonna get together and talk about our writing. And so moving to Minneapolis was the first time I really had that, and I've really been able to kind of keep that as a, keep a writing community. And so anything that's going to allow me to just kind of keep going, I think is great, whether that's a faculty position or doing anything else really related that allow me to wake up and keep writing.
Well, thank you so much. I have so much gratitude for you to come on and read and answer questions. If folks follow this man, and there's his website, and you'll get updates with it. It lists all kinds of appearances, awards and honors, publications. I'm sure when the book comes out, you'll hear about it here. And this is definitely a dude to watch in the literary world for sure. So thank you so much for appearing at the Virtual Fridays Diary Literary Series.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everybody who attended this. Glad to see some friendly faces I know too.
All right. And those watching on Facebook, thank you for viewing. The program will continue without you in the open mic. So if you ever want to participate in that, go to the Zoom link instead. But we do appreciate you checking it out.